Okay. All right, David, to you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Matthew 22 in the Revised Standard Version. Then the Pharisees went and took counsel how to entangle him in his talk. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the very word of God truthfully and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the money for the tax." And they brought him a coin. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So we begin with prayer again. God, the idea of rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God. Gods, we find it easy to listen to. The difficulty is to figure out what belongs where. What really does belong to Caesar? What really does belong to God? Is there any overlap between the two, or are they always different, maybe even contrary? We know that our community of faith has struggled with this for many years, from its very beginning. And we know that Douglas Morgan has studied this very carefully. We are thankful for him. We are thankful for the scholarship he has done. And we are thankful that we can learn from him this morning. In Christ's name, amen. Welcome again to everybody, but particularly to Douglas Morgan.
Thank you very much.
I understood just from your conversation with Forrest Howe that you're in Brooklyn, New York.
That's right.
I think of you as being in the Washington, D.C. What's happening?
Well, actually, I'm no longer at Washington Adventist. Now, I'm essentially, well, I hate the word retired. I don't like that too much, but I'm part-time with the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists and just doing some online teaching. But I had shuttled back and forth. I got married about 15 years ago, and my wife and I have a place here in Brooklyn, as well as we used to go back and forth between here and Silver Spring. But now I'm pretty much all the time here in Brooklyn.
Wow. Now, I cannot help but recall that you spent some of your life in Lincoln, Nebraska.
That's right.
So how do Lincoln and Brooklyn compare?
There's no comparison, really. Both places have people, but it's a lot more. It's unbelievably concentrated and hectic. I remember when I was in college, we would have some students from New York, and I thought, they're just awfully rough and aggressive on the basketball court. But that's just, that's just the way of life here. It's not a mean thing or an ill will thing, but anyway, suffice to say, there's quite a contrast.
Wow, but you're enjoying it as well as you did Lincoln.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Maybe even more. Well, tell us a little bit more about your own life. I noticed from the book that you are the son of a minister. Does that mean you moved often, like many ministers' families do?
Yes, although in my case, you mentioned my attending Union College, living, well, I don't know if you mentioned that, but living in Lincoln. And so when I was, I believe, in third grade, after several moves, we came to Lincoln, where my father joined the pastoral staff of the College View Church. But then for the next decade, really, which took me into college, he had about 3 or 4 different positions, but they were all in Lincoln. So they didn't entail a move. And then I just stayed there at the college and graduated there.
Well, you're so fortunate. I always found moving a wrenching experience, and that you were able to stay in one place and put down some roots, I think must have been a blessing to you. Now, you went to college at Union College there in Lincoln. And if I remember correctly, you were involved in the production of a journal called College People. Do I have that correct, Lee?
That's right. That's right. And the Collegiate Sabbath School Quarterly, although I was not the founder. Eugene Shirley was really the founder, but I came along after him and working with that along with the College People, which was intended as a replacement for Insight, but only for the college and perhaps graduate school group. But it didn't really take hold very well, to be honest with you. But yeah.
Oh, I thought it was splendid. So we had the youth instructor, which fulfilled this mission and came to a conclusion. Then we had Insight magazine, and I think Roland Hegstead and Chuck Scriven worked on that. And then somehow along came College People from Union College in Lincoln, and it was a very attractive and intellectually stimulating journal, I thought. And so then what happened?
Well, yeah, that magazine only lasted a couple of years, but we had there, because the Sabbath School Quarterly started in Lincoln, the Collegiate Quarterly, we had a little office there, and the North American division gradually became involved in they used a term, was a bit ominous sounding, called regularization. But anyway, after in 1986, I believe it was, then the quarterly was continued, but edited in Washington, D.C., and the College People magazine was discontinued. It just, I thank you for your kind words about the content, and I do feel good about quite a bit of that, but it just didn't, it didn't take hold in terms of sales and so forth.
Well, Bill Lovelace used to say that the parents won't pay for a journal the youngsters will read. And so that's maybe you got caught in that, but it was very attractive and very stimulating intellectually. So I'm pleased that it lasted as long as it did, and regret that it didn't last longer, and not exactly sure what that word regularization means, but it doesn't sound very happy to me. Now, you went from Union College straight to the University of Chicago, did you?
Yes, yes, the next step in my education, yes.
So had you majored in religion or history or both at Union College?
I majored in theology with a minor in history.
Uh-huh. And when you went to University of Chicago, were you in the graduate programs or in the divinity school or both? How did that work?
I was in the divinity school and the history of Christianity program. And so that covers all of the history of Christianity. But you choose different areas as you prepare for the comprehensive exams. And so, and you're encouraged to take courses as it fits with your program outside the divinity school. So I was able to do some things in the American, history of American social movements. Actually, that's it was a 2-quarter sequence from Professor Arthur Mann, and that really was quite significant and influential for me. But anyway, the degree was through the divinity school.
Okay, so you had to do Old Testament, New Testament, philosophy, religion, all that.
Well, there was a master's degree that was very general in that sense, but the doctorate was history of Christianity, early medieval,
Okay.
Reformation, and
Now you
modern
worked with
American.
Sidney. No, you did not work with Sidney Alstrom. He was at Yale, correct?
Right.
But you did work with Marty, and I was
That's
surprised, Gerald Brower as well.
Yes.
He must have been an elder statesman when you were there.
It was toward the latter end of his full-time teaching career. That's true. Yes.
What was Marty like to work with?
Oh, well, absolutely wonderful. I mean, just in terms of a warm and kind and individual who made you feel like you were important. Now, he didn't give you unlimited time. You signed up for, I think, 15-minute time slots in his office. So it wasn't like you could just go in and chat. But yeah, it was just a wonderful, enriching experience. And even though, I'll share one anecdote. Of course, you can cut me off if I go too long, but in one course I remember where it was really centered on the students making presentations and seminar style. And when one of us was making our presentation, he would sit there and read his mail, opening his mail, reading. But then he would really, he heard everything you said. And you say, now about 10 minutes ago, you said this, so he could, I guess my point is that he was kind of phenomenal in that sense, but really he didn't intimidate or try to be overbearing with it. Just a wonderful Christian gentleman.
He published so much and was active in so many different ways. I once heard Jesse Jackson say that he called the divinity school there at Chicago and asked to speak with Professor Marty, and the person said, no, you can't do that. He's busy. So Jesse Jackson said, well, what is he doing? And well, he's writing a book. Well, Jesse Jackson said, I'll just hold here on the phone until he's over with it. He's written so many books.
Yes.
They come off so rapidly. Well,
yes.
Now, did you enjoy his preface to your book or forward to your book? It seemed to me just a little bit snippy and snooty. What did you think?
I was just thrilled that he did it. Now, there was that element. I can understand your perception there, especially in the lead-in. But he states there, and I had not done the research to see the extent which this is true, but that it was unusual for him to do this for us, especially a book that had grown out of a dissertation. So I just felt pleased that he did it at all. And yeah.
It was interesting because he begins, I don't remember the exact numbers, but he begins the first line with something like, well, 98.56% of the members of citizens of the United States are not Seventh-day Adventists.
Right.
And I wondered how many are not Missouri Synod Lutherans. So now, was he Missouri Synod or was he ECLA?
Well, he started out Missouri Synod, but then in the 70s, they had a split. Now, the acronyms are kind of escaping me now, but there was a new Lutheran denomination that came out of that he affiliated with. But his background is Missouri Synod. He's also in Nebraska.
They're very conservative, very conservative. In some ways, yes. I think more conservative than Adventists are. But they were going through those tensions about the same time we were.
Yes.
Now, this is a dissertation. Every dissertation has a thesis. And my way of putting it would be this. The thesis of this dissertation is that the Adventist theology of history accounts for its otherwise perplexing simultaneous emphasis upon otherworldliness and this worldliness, period. What do you think?
Yeah, that's good. Excellent. In fact, I think that I would maybe want to get in their thought that theology of history accounts for a pattern of action that differs from other pre-millennialists or other people who otherwise, sociologically anyway, you might expect to be the same, yeah, or similar.
Now, as I recall, the theology of history that you mentioned, that sort of explicates what's otherwise perplexing, right? We are talking about the end of the world all the time, and then we're building institutions that are meant to last a long time. And many people wonder if we really do believe that the end of the world is near, or if we really do believe that these institutions are worthwhile. But instead of seeing these as at odds with each other, you hold that this theology of history makes this rational and understandable. But the theology of history, as I recall, has three aspects to it, like a triangle: freedom, and then dissent, and hope. Is that correct?
Yes, that was my attempt to distill some points from the broad, what we often call the great controversy perspective on history. So yes, there's more that could be said, but I'll yeah.
Could you say a word about each of these? Take a minute or two. Don't feel rushed. What is the contribution of the notion of freedom to Adventism's theology of history?
Well, I think that one way of looking at it is to look at the historical emergence in which Adventists felt that they were not being accorded freedom. And so this notion that we are free individuals with the power of choice, but more pointedly, in terms of sort of a historical flow of ideas, there was the Restorationist movement. There was something called the Christian Connection, which no longer exists, but there was a strain of radical Protestantism that really emphasized individual freedom and no creeds, no organization should be able to dictate or to you, especially in terms of your religious choices. So that's I think that's part of it. And then when Ellen White writes of the great controversy, then it's sort of put in a broader cosmic scope. But I think it also has that historical origin of this sort of the radical freedom of the individual conscience, albeit within a strain of Protestant, radical Protestant thought in America.
There was something called the NRA back then, which is not the same as the NRA today. How does that relate to all this?
Well, that was the National Reform Association, which came about during the Civil War, but really began to flourish afterwards. And it was, it really, the Civil War connection is that it grew out of the notion that we need to have days of fasting and prayer so that God will bless our cause. So these were Protestant clergy. I mean, Protestantism loosely connected was still really the dominant cultural force in America at this time. Now, the NRA was not huge in itself, but it's in that orbit, and its ideas resonate. And the notion that is still with us, really, it's the notion of Christian nationalism, but specifically that we must have a constitutional amendment that clears up this problem of a secular, godless constitution, so that we will be shown to be a Christian nation. And Sunday laws relate to this, that a righteous and Christian nation will show its allegiance by honoring a Sunday. And so that maybe I'll just add one more thing at this point, and that is, although I think often in our literature as Adventists, we've probably exaggerated the sense in which our literature was foresighted and saw it was coming. I do think that there is an element of credit there for seeing here something that was not already obviously huge, but would grow in influence, and that is a nationalization of this idea that we need laws that will solidify Christian identity, to nationalize Christianity, as Joseph H. Wagner put it, which was not necessarily 100% apparent. The signs were there, but that is something distinctive that our pioneers were talking about quite early on, before it became as prominent on the national scene as it would.
I want to come back to that and see if there's a link between that Christian nationalism and the Christian nationalism of our day. But before that, let's look at the other two sides of the triangle that make up the Adventist theology of history, the second one being dissent. What would you like to say about that?
Well, it's that it is people on the margins dissenting. And now I'm speaking mainly in terms of religious conscience now, but there is an element, there is a social element to that. And it runs through the book, The Great Controversy. It's seen elsewhere in Ellen White's writings. And that is that it is these people who have stood up against authority, wrongly assumed and asserted. They have driven history forward. They are history's royal line, as Ellen White writes in one place, not the conquerors and presidents and so forth. So that there is also, with that, the assumption that the powers of this world will really never become truly benevolent. That you're gonna really need to be on guard, so to speak, vigilant, and it's from that position of dissent that the faithful are really, going to be. So I guess another way of putting it is that's in part where the controversy comes in. It's always going to be a minority prophetic voice, if you will, in one way or another. And that's what sort of keeps the faithful line going forward, so to speak.
Okay. When you spoke about a minority prophetic voice, at one point you draw the distinction between political apocalyptic and political prophetic. I think that's relating to what you've just mentioned. Could you explain those?
Yes. Now, those terms are actually drawn from Jonathan Butler, but and they're talking about how at the very earliest era of Millerite Adventism, and then sort of pre-organization Seventh-day Adventism, sometimes called Sabbatarian Adventism, that Adventists were very, very outspoken. And this even goes into the Civil War period, that America is the beast. That's something that we have sort of sustained and has changed through the years as to how it's interpreted, but it's that second beast of Revelation 13. But but more, I mean, it was connected with the issues of the day, with slavery and with religious intolerance as they saw it. But the apocalyptic element is that, well, this is a revelatory, this is what's going on behind the scenes, but there's nothing we can do to change it. But gradually then, and I would put this beginning in the late 1850s, the transition begins that the Seventh-day Adventists begin to move into a prophetic mode, meaning that there's an actual intent to at least put a stop to, or a check upon, might be a better way of putting it, upon evil in government, in society, that we do want to cast an influence. I guess, you could see how that goes along with a dawning recognition that, well, we don't know how long it will be before the Lord will come, and we're going to have to begin to act in ways that have the present life in view, at least, for a undetermined foreseeable time. And with that then goes this transition to saying that our influence needs to be on the right side. It's not enough simply to use your voice and pen, although that's still an important part of it.
So if I understood you correctly, the apocalyptic motif at that point prompted a kind of political pacifism, but the prophetic shift engaged the Adventist community in the political life with some hope of making a positive difference.
Yes. Now, I'm not sure that that transition from passivity to action, even though what I just said a moment ago kind of relates to that, I think that I had begun to rethink that a little bit when I wrote the book, but I have come to view that somewhat differently now. And Kevin Burton there at Andrews has been a source of research and prompting to kind of move away from this idea to say that just because people are not in a particular mode of action, that they are somehow passive and withdrawn, and that they don't, that they're hopeless and just despairing and crying out. I think it's a little more complicated than that, but anyway.
Okay. Now the third side of this triangle is hope.
Right.
And here's where we get into the difference between premillennialism and postmillennialism and different kinds of hope that were being offered at the time. How about saying something along those lines?
Right. So, hope in the ultimate sense, number one, because why would you sort of go through life in this endeavor to be faithful dissenters if you didn't believe that you're headed for a positive outcome, but also in the negative sense that hope should not be invested in any other entity, not in the United States, as great as it is, or any other source of hope. And so the post-millennialism that you mentioned, well, that had its start, in a deeply Bible-centered Puritan theology of working out these prophecies, and how this millennium is a little bit, it's a little bit tricky. If you read Revelation, people have to figure out different solutions where to fit it in. But the post-millennial idea was that a Christ visible, transforming, appearing that ushers in the eternal age does not actually come until the end of the millennium. But then what happens as that becomes a very popular notion in the United States, among Protestants is that there is to some degree a merger of that with optimism about America itself and its institutions. That there will be, sure, there needs to be reform, but the hope of the world, and this really would become pronounced in the late 19th century and around the turn of the 20th century, that America is the vehicle of the millennium. And so the Adventist perspective was a protest against that and say that is misplaced hope.
Okay. So I haven't forgotten the issue of Christian nationalism, because that's where I want to end. But maybe I can go back and then ask you to comment just briefly on the different periods of the story that you tell. And you have here 6 chapters, and each chapter covers a certain segment of this history. Maybe you can give us a little summary of what happened in each of these times. The first one is called Remnant versus Republic, and that's 1844 to 1861.
Right. So this is the period in which the remnant is speaking out very forcefully against the Republic, in particular, over slavery. You have this 2-horned beast, and the idea was the lamb-like beast looks like a lamb, speaks like a dragon, but it has these 2 horns. And so J. N. Andrews and the other early interpreters said, well, it must be that one horn is civil liberty and the other is political liberty, or Protestantism and republicanism, not the party so much or at all really, but the small r, I guess you could say. And that while America has manifested these in an impressive way through the years, but there is that dark underside in it, and that is getting worse as you see the fugitive slave law, and then the Kansas-Nebraska and the Dred Scott decision, and it's all also coming into that is the idea that we should not obey the fugitive slave law. So it's a pretty antagonistic relationship rhetorically in that period, 1861 being the beginning of the Civil War.
Okay, so what changes occurred in the second period that you have called an activist remnant, 1861 through 1886? Yes.
Now, dates are always a periodization, I'll put it that way. It's rare that to be precise, because the beginnings of this change that I'm seeing, I'm using 1861 as a marker, but I think it began really in the late 1850s, where a lot of the early Adventists were Garrisonian abolitionists. Now, the reason I say Garrisonian specifically is that William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous of the abolitionists, he was against voting. He was against connections with politics, because he believed that what we have to do is to transform the nation spiritually, morally. And up until 1856, neither party would take anything like a stand against slavery. 1856, the Republicans, for the first time, come along and say, well, we're standing against the expansion of slavery. Well, I say this to say that many Adventists, at least an element of this non-participation in politics and voting, was not so much like this moral squeamishness that we must, I mean, that's figures in, but it's also a principle to say that we are not going to aid and abet either of these corrupt parties. But that's all background for saying that begins to change. And point where I can most concretely see something as bringing about this shift is in Battle Creek. It was around 1858 or 1859. The Adventists had made that their headquarters around 1855. But in Ellen White's diary, she says that some men of intemperance came to the office today, that is the Review publishing office, and they complimented us for being like, I think she says, being like the Quakers, and that we did not get involved in politics. And these men of intemperance were praising us for that, but she said, well, the gist of it is that this is an evil influence at work, and actually we do, this is our city. She actually uses that phrase, and she saw, I mean, as usual, she sees spiritual forces behind everything, and that this was a demonic thing. And she says, I hope the devil is going to be disappointed. The devil is trying to keep us out of trying to influence for the right in our city. May the devil be disappointed, is my prayer, or words to that effect. And so I think that we begin to see a transition now. It's our city, you know, and so then it parallels Garrison, because even in 1860, well, James White would say, well, those of us who did voted for Lincoln to a man. Garrison is a little more ambivalent, but even in 1860, he does not really want to encourage his followers. Now, by the way, there were many other abolitionists who rejected his no voting view, but just to clarify that. But then in 1864, the war has been dragging on. Lincoln is up for re-election, and it is not a foregone conclusion. His opponent, General George McClellan, the fear is that McClellan will make peace with the Confederacy, and slavery will continue. And so Garrison is all in to re-elect Lincoln. And here in the Review, we have J.N. Andrews saying, well, now those who think that they can go to the ballot box and smuggle a pro-slavery vote through and expect that that's going to escape the notice of the final judgment, well, you will be sorely disappointed. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but we do see very strongly implicit endorsement in the Review. So anyway.
So you better get out and vote, and you better get out and vote for the right person. Otherwise,
that's right.
In the judgment day, you might have to give an account for your wrongdoing.
That you said it better right there.
Wow, that is a shift. I did not know Garrison was against voting. That's interesting.
Right. Now, again, I would emphasize that by even as early as the 1840s, you have a split, and the political abolitionists, even though he goes down in history still, I think, as the most famous white abolitionist anyway. By this time, he does not define the movement at all. But yes, it's very that was somewhat of a surprise to me as well. But even as late as 1856, and in a more muted way in 1860, his point is, well, until we get a party that is really willing and able to put an end to slavery, we're wasting our time. We're getting things backwards here. So anyway, yeah.
I'd like to pause here and explore this issue a little bit further by referring to Joe Willie's idea, the late T. Joe Willie, who has suggested in print and in spoken word that Ellen White was an abolitionist, but she was also a racist. And his view was that she wanted the slaves to be free from slavery, but she did not want them to be viewed as equal to white people. And I think it's fair to say there was a little tension between Joe and Roy Branson on that one. I think sometimes it got quite intense. Have you had a chance to look into that?
Yes, I think in a word, I really would side pretty strongly against T. Joe on that one. Ellen White was influenced by her times. Her views did not measure up to what we might think would be the highest, most correct standard. But I think if you look, you look at that book, The Southern Work, that was put out in the 1890s, I contend that that is liberation theology. She says God acted to free the slaves. Now look how they've been treated afterwards. And she invokes Luke 4, Spirit of the Lord is upon me, good tidings of the captive and so forth, to say that we need to not only teach them about a better theological religious understanding, but we've got to equip them with the ability to read, with skills. And so, you can trade quotes back and forth, but there are plenty to say that show that, well, she says very clearly that there are many colored people, was the term that she used, that are much more advanced under the circumstances they're doing far better in terms of intellect and achievement than their white counterparts are doing. So to me, the overall picture is no question about it. I believe Ellen White totally was dedicated to the notion of human equality that transcends race.
Well, I think it's really important to make that point because, as you say, Thomas Joe Willie has been making the other point, and I don't think that should be left out there without some response. Now, I would think that the transition from an activist remnant into apocalyptic faith and industrial America, which is your third chapter, would be quite smooth, not too abrupt. What would you say?
Yeah, well, see, I think that one way that I differ slightly from Jonathan Butler, who really, in many ways, was my mentor. He taught me his first 2 years of teaching there at Union College. He inspired me both with his teaching and his writing. But I don't see quite so sharp a distinction between the political, what he called the political apocalyptic and the political prophetic. And what I mean is that although there are, I think we can demarcate periods that are characterized by certain things, that the apocalyptic perspective remains all the way through, even to today. Now, it changes in a lot of ways and becomes maybe more complex, but by that title, Apocalyptic Faith in Industrial America, I'm saying that Adventists still retain this apocalyptic worldviews, apocalyptic theology of history. So how then does it connect with America as it has been transformed by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration after the Civil War?
Well, I think your growing disease about making too sharp a distinction is paralleled in the biblical studies people who are increasingly doubting that there's such a sharp distinction in the Bible between the prophetic and the apocalyptics. They're more, the apocalyptics were quite prophetic and vice versa. So, yeah, it's a nice typology and it's helpful, but maybe not to be ridden too far. Now, it does seem to me that if we take the two chapters we've just been talking about, that is 2 and 3, and then get into chapter 4, which is called Conscientious Cooperation, and chapter 5, which is called A Flexible Wall, it does seem to me there's a noticeable difference between what happened in those two chapters and in what happened in the previous two chapters. That fundamentally something had shifted.
Right. Well, yes, I agree with you there, and I think probably most who are in the class here have heard of this term conscientious cooperator, because well, I'll give you my reading, which I still find that people don't agree with, but in terms of the military service position, Adventists were pacifist in the Civil War. That was the original stand. And they explicitly equated their position with that of the Quakers. Now, they were willing to accept alternative service, but that the word non-combatant then was used basically synonymously with pacifist. It didn't designate something, some distinct middle way between pacifism and engaging in combat if you're conscripted. Well, I take a moment on this to say then that the contrast then, when we come to the conscientious cooperator model, it actually may not entail that much of a difference in terms of the action that an Adventist who's drafted takes, but yet there's a whole new ethos. For one thing, the military now has non-combatant modes of service much more as an or one possibility for draftees. And so the World War I, things had been a little bit shaky between Adventists and the US government, and certainly other governments as well. But now as we get into World War II, the run up to it, there's the Medical Cadet Corps to prepare Adventists for a service. And I know we have a future Sabbath designated on Adventists and war, but just let me take this just a bit further to clarify conscientious cooperator. The idea was that we will do anything short of or other than carrying the weapon ourselves and wielding, using the weapon ourselves to support the national military effort. And so it was actually a newspaper reporter, not an Adventist, but he's reporting on the Medical Cadet Corps camp near Fort Worth, Texas. And he says, these people are really conscientious cooperators. Oh. They're not objectors. Mm. So I just think that that is a good frame or lens maybe for a broader, more cooperative relationship with the American government, with the American public order broadly. You don't have, well, one way that I deal with it in the book, and I think is one way of focusing it, is that this talk about this two-horned beast of Revelation 13 now really changes. It's not so much, look what America is doing hypocritically now, but it's like, well, prophecy tells that someday America will betray its values, but that's not now. And really, it's more of a group of religious zealots who are going to take over the government. It's not really our great American republic that is going to turn persecutor like this. And so that, just frames a whole new way of a more accommodating, more cooperative, what else, what other words can I say to sort of, break that down a little bit more, relationship between Adventists and the American public order?
This is probably impossible But I wish you would have a graduate student who would study when the American flag first started being in the sanctuaries
Right.
of Adventist churches. Do you have any idea when that happened?
I don't have the details. I think Ron Osborne might have done a little bit more, but there is an anecdote which I can relate that I think is telling. And that is a missionary by the name of Samuel Konigmacher. He went to Africa in 1909. And apparently his furloughs were few and far between, but he came back in 1941 and he went to La Sierra and he said they came into chapel with these uniforms and there was a flag there and prayers for America and all. And he just, it was like, what kind of church have I come back to? We never did any of this before. So for him, that it was just a complete change. And his account does center around it's not the narrow question of are we going to participate in the military or even combat or whatever. It's the trappings that just, I mean, you can just tell from reading his account that he's just stunned. And so he starts writing letters to the leaders, and some have tried to say, well, he's old, he's maybe getting a little off or something, but still, I think it's a revealing anecdote. Between 1909 and 1941, Brother Konigmacher, anyway, saw just a shocking what to him was a shocking change.
Wow! So for that 30 years, right into that period of time, now it can get a pastor into deep trouble if he suggests removing the American flag from an Adventist sanctuary today. Right. I think it'd be easier to remove the cross than to remove the flag, and so that's quite a shift. Now to the last of your chapters. So I've clustered 2 and 3 together and 4 and 5 together, but the last one you have is called a pluralistic remnant. And that brings us down to the year 2000, I think.
Right. Well, I think the thought there is that it's becoming more and more difficult to generalize. Politically, in the specific sense of party politics, Adventists were connected. Just it was in the air that Adventists were Republicans. Of course, you would never get that kind of official pronouncement, but it went back to that early connection with radical republicanism. Well, the Republican Party changed quite a bit, but we come down to the era of Vietnam War and also Watergate, and we find that the General Conference liaison to a Congress, at least one liaison for public affairs or something to that effect, is writing letters to President Nixon saying, we're with you, Mr. President. Other churches might criticize you, but anyway, that's background for saying that that identification. Well, if you indulge me with another anecdote, the evangelist E.E. Cleveland like to tell these stories, and one of them was that they wanted to make him a GC vice president or something, and he didn't really want that, but somehow he didn't want to say no directly, so he sort of plotted with his wife that they went to a dinner party with the General Conference president and other top leaders. And this was in around 72. And he schemed with his wife to say something against Nixon and sort of bring that up so that then he wouldn't get the offer to move into this what he saw as a more bureaucratic thing or whatever. Well, I just mentioned that to say that you have a growing, and since when the book was published is even more the case. I think the Pew study in 2014, something like 37% white, 32% Black or African heritage, 15% Hispanic. Well, that goes hand in hand with a much different political configuration. Plus, I talked in the book, I talk about the spectrum crowd and it's sort of this more growing professional intellectual class, which is by no means uniform at all. I mean, you have a lot of different political outlooks, but you do have in the Branson mode people who are outspoken for social reform in a way that was not the case, say, so much in the mid 20th century. So there's a diversity of voices, and it's hard to generalize about how the remnant relates to the Republic by the turn of the 21st century.
Now, suppose you were right to put out another edition of your book, which has a 7th chapter, which brings us from 2000 down to 2021, another generation. Would it be basically a continuation of chapter 6, or would you see some new things emerging?
Yeah, I have thought about that, and I struggle with it. Maybe the best thing I can say is a question mark, and that is to say that I'm concerned, but I don't know that a more rabid far-right politics has come in to Adventism in America than was the case, because I tried to argue strongly in the book that here was one of the main points for my thesis of the impact of ideas, that that the Adventists, you might expect them to be all in with the moral majority and so forth, but they weren't. In fact, they were outspoken, at least in our publications, against it because of this distinctive theology of history. At least that's how I saw it. Well, I think that still holds true considerably, but I'm a little, I just have to wonder. And I don't know how large a segment that certain voices among us speak for, but I do wonder about that. But the pluralistic element, I think, has only increased. I think that's about all I can say, just right at the moment. But it,
okay.
Yeah.
One last question before we take a break, and that is, how has this story changed, if at all, as Adventism has become international, overwhelmingly international?
Yeah, and I struggle with that one too, because I just have not given real rigorous thought to it. One thing that I think is significant, it's kind of the flip side of what I was maybe pondering and worrying about a little bit in my previous response, but that is that the American church itself is being more and more changed by immigration. And to me that, well, I would venture at least one possibility, and that is something at least is said to be true about evangelical Christianity, and that is that the Christians from the global South, many of them do not have this kind of bifurcation between individual morality and an interest in seeing justice in the public square that many evangelicals have had. And so it could be that a more global church would influence us to a more holistic view of what it means to be a Christian in relation to the politics in the public realm. But then on the other hand, I hear often that really it's the old missionary Adventism of the earlier decades of the 20th century that's dominating the Adventism in where it is growing so rapidly. And so that would have other ramifications. So all that is to say, I don't have a handle on that at all.
Well, we're pretty close to it. We've worked you very hard, Douglas. Let's take a break. And if you don't mind, I'm going to invite you to disappear during the break, because
Okay.
people will chat with you, and then we'll miss out on what they'll have to say, and you back and forth. So maybe we'll come back in about 10 or 12 minutes. Is that all right for us? And when we come back, maybe we can have Douglas begin with this question of Christian nationalism in the 19th century and Christian nationalism in our own time. Let's start there, and then from there, let's go to the questions that people may have. So if you have a question you want to ask, or if you have a comment you would like to make, be sure to let Forrest Howe know during the break or subsequently, and he will put you on the queue. All right, it's 11:32. Let's try back at 11:45. How about that?
Okay, thank you, David. And I'll just be looking for hands to be raised either electronically or manually. So you can ask your short question or make your short comment at that time. So I'll be watching for hands, and okay, take a break. You said what? 11:45. Okay, 5. We just got it recording, and I'm seeing Dr. Morgan here. So I think we could start, David. And I see Anastasia, who wants to ask a short question. So
I think sometimes we should ask her to ask a long question.
no, we don't have time, David.
Dr. Alexander, you're a saint. Thanks for being here every time. Now, Doug, maybe I can have just a little bit of fun with you before we get into this heavy duty stuff of Christian nationalism. And that is, I went through your book at the index, and I clustered names thematically. And I've got a whole page of these clusters, which I wish we had an afternoon to discuss. But I can't resist 3 of them, okay? The first one is Jonathan Edwards and Charles Finney. How do they figure into your story?
Well, they were the great leaders intellectually, and with Finney, especially in terms of activism, of revivalistic American Protestantism and post-millennial eschatology. Jonathan Edwards with what is often called the First Great Awakening in the mid decades of the 18th century, and then Finney in the Second Great Awakening, which some scholars see the Millerite Adventist movement, Second Advent movement, as kind of a final outburst of and a new vitalization of the Second Awakening. But in brief, that's where Finney and Edwards come in.
I was stunned to see that Finney believed the post-millennial, that the millennium in the post-millennial view could have begun within 3 years.
Yeah.
If the Christians had gotten together, that's as much of a date setting as we were involved in.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an important perspective. He didn't give a particular date on the calendar, but it wasn't long before the millennial perspective was proven as wrong as Millerite date setting.
Okay, here's another cluster. Charles Scriven, Roy Branson, and Charles Teal.
Well, so there you have a very interesting group that one way of putting it would be that they created a large segment or very much influenced a large segment of what I call this more pluralistic remnant. But interestingly enough, they did so by recovering much of that early Adventist radicalism, if you will. So these were all figures who became influential in the 70s, I guess you would say, maybe 60s and 70s, and injected a new emphasis and strong influence. And then they all have very pronounced views on this question of Adventism and politics, Adventism in the public order, in a way that had not been really, again, it had not been evident much prior to that.
Okay, the last one really is sort of whimsical, but here are the two names, Ralph Larson and David Larson.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so in this whole question of theology of history, I mean, I tried to chart some ways in which belief about prophecy, was becoming differentiated, and so that is involved with Ralph Larson, your father, in a desire to reinvigorate. I loosely associate. I can't actually remember exactly what I said there, but there was a desire to reinvigorate distinctly Adventist eschatology and not lose that to certain trends that threatened it. And I guess David Larson I would lump with those other three. Again, I honestly, I forget exactly what I said, but anyway, yeah.
How could you possibly forget that? Okay.
Oh, well.
How about saying something about Christian nationalism in the 19th century and Christian nationalism in the 21st century, and if there's any link between them?
Well, I took the opportunity to check a couple of definitions. Christianity today defines Christian nationalism as the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. And I thought, well, now that's a little maybe simplistic and popularized, but then I went briefly to a book by Perry and Whitehead, Taking America Back for God. And it's almost as straightforward. Christian nationalism, we mean that to describe an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. Now, when you come to the particulars of the identity and culture, I think no doubt some differences could be brought out, but I guess I'm left thinking really at its essence, there isn't much of a difference. If I could just share what Joseph Harvey Wagner, father of E.J. Wagner, but the main early editor of the Signs of the Times, not only that, but the American Sentinel, which was the predecessor to Liberty Magazine. And so this NRA group that we talked about earlier and its allies that were pushing for the constitutional amendment and national Sunday law and so forth, he said that their program was to nationalize, and he put these two words together, nationalize Christianity. So to me, the commonality stands out more than differences. Granted, a lot changes over a century plus when it comes to the details.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you so much for spending your time and knowledge with us. I very much appreciate it, and so do the other members of our group here,
Well,
and then on Facebook and on YouTube. Over to you, Forrest.
Okay, I've got a couple questions, people here, but I'd like to ask a question kind of building on David's last question. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Greg L. Frazier, who wrote the book, The Religious Belief of America's Founders. He's a graduate of Claremont University. It's his basic thesis that the early American founders were not Christian. They were deist or theistic rationalists. And he makes a very powerful case that except for possibly Adams or Patrick Henry, that Christianity was not a prevailing view of the founders. And matter of fact, I think in the Treaty of Tripoli, it says clearly that America is not a Christian nation. How do you think we moved from that situation to where we were in the 1860s? Any comment on that?
Well, yeah, but first of all, just let me take if I don't get another opportunity, I just want to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to be with you, and what a genuine pleasure and really an honor it is to be able to do this and to be asked to do it. So the Adventist periodicals, the Sentinel and Religious Liberty, they loved that treaty with Tripoli because that, seemed to just make the point powerfully. But at the same time, there has been a strong element. Let me put it this way. The Second Great Awakening, at least for many, was a reaction against Jeffersonian deism and this secularism and infidelity. And everybody, I think, seemed to want to not radically undermine the greatness of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so forth. And so you can't avoid the role of Jefferson and so forth. But my point is that that stream of saying that this secular definition is really not definitive of America. Really, I mean, in part, it goes back to the conflict between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans in the early era, partly. Anyway, I guess revivalism would go a long way toward answering your question, so that the mentality that I just spoke of, that really did not like Jefferson, at least when it comes to religion. Thomas Paine, major figure in influencing American revolutionary attitudes while he came to be vilified among many American Protestants. And so this idea that that was a flaw. Yes, our Constitution is great, but we'd like to see, the Declaration says that the rights are granted to us by God, endowed by our Creator. Well, we'd like to see some language like that in the Constitution, even to mention Christ. So I better stop there, because these are just my attempts to maybe shed tiny little glimpses of light on it, but that's about the best I can do at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I just have one little bit on that. And David asked about the differences in the white nationalism of today and the Christian nationalism of the 1860s. How would they apply this with the the pluralism in the United States as compared to the 1860s, you know, with so many much more of a Jewish population, atheistic population, Islamic. Has there been any thought on that?
So you mean the late 19th century people that we're talking about that wanted to push for a Christian America? How did, okay, yeah. Well, I think frankly that there was an anti-immigrant, definitely from the standpoint of we do not want a lot of Roman Catholics coming in and voting, you know, and possibly exerting too great a political influence. And they're not good Sunday keepers either. The Sunday's more of a holiday. So there was that anti-immigrant element, not as virulent probably as we see shockingly from some quarters in America today. And I would also say that in a quieter way, this was, there was an element of reuniting America after those horrible wounds and divisions of the Civil War, at the expense of the old, when I say old, I'm talking about Civil War era, abolitionist movement era, radical egalitarianism on race. We're gonna sort of set that aside in the name of reuniting a Christian America. Again, many of these people that I'm speaking of, they would, let's put it this way, they would not be explicitly racist, but they would be more comfortable about sort of allying and accommodating the concerns of those who were. Then in the name of unification around all kinds of causes. So I think that there is a similarity there as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have greatly appreciated your presentation and look forward to more. And now we'll go to my dear friend Anastasia, who has a short question. Anastasia?
Thank you so much. You're my wonderful friend. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I appreciate your scholarship and you being here. And my main short question is, are there any voices, if any, in the Adventist Church that counter the white Christian nationalism? And at the times of Martin Luther King, were there any Adventist leaders marching along all the other or most of the other leaders of churches in the marches? And thank you very much.
Sure. Well, I might start with the second one. The positive end of that is that the person for whom the class is named did march in Selma, and there were other individual Adventists who were involved in the civil rights movement, both Black and white. But at the same time, I think that we do have to recognize that the church as a whole, or in terms of an organizational stand, this was viewed as politics and we don't get involved in that. Of course, I mean, I'm paraphrasing now some editorials that came out in the review in the mid-60s. And the notion was, of course, we believe in racial equality, but we don't support marches and shrill demonstrations and trying to influence the government in that way. We prefer to work through religious, spiritual means. So there is a mixed picture. Now, there may be a bridge, though, back to the first part of your question, and I hope that I speak to it, in a way that you were desiring to find out about. But I did a little study of The Message magazine, which was the Black-oriented evangelistic magazine. And lo and behold, Martin Luther King comes off much more prominently and favorably portrayed in The Message. I don't want to overstate that. It was still rather a moderate voice, I would say, when it came to equal rights, the political assertion of equality, but it's a much different than you would see in the other periodicals. So that as we see the proportion of Black Seventh-day Adventists increasing in North America, now I think it's only one element, but it's an important one, so that today, especially in the North American division, if you look at the statements that are put out, the publications, the events that are distinctly North American, you see quite a bit of voices that are very much trying to advocate. And for example, I'm just looking at some of the recordings of the pastors' convention, the convention, as they call it, the president of the North American division and his late predecessor, to maybe a lesser degree, but I heard Elder Bryant, say social justice is part of our message and the gospel. So I think that we do have a significant change. Not to say that there aren't counter voices as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And thank you for your voice. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
All right, I'd like to go now to Simona. Simona?
Very much for this presentation. I have a couple of questions. So you were talking about the idea of freedom being one of the main dominant forces in our development of our theology. So how does the idea of Christian nationalism mix with this idea of freedom, considering that Christian nationalism denies freedom to everybody who doesn't subscribe to that specific way of thinking? So it's directly contrary to the idea of freedom. That's one question. And the second, in all this presentation, I haven't heard a single thing about misogyny. How did misogyny, which is extremely prevalent in our church, and it has been, and which I find baffling considering that everybody is quoting Ellen White every day, how did that play in this, white male Christian domination theology that is so entrenched in our church?
Well, yeah, the point that you made about freedom versus Christian nationalism, I think is the very point that the Adventists who were involved in advocating for religious liberty from the late 19th century down to more recent times would agree, and that they were making, that America is a place where there should be freedom of religious expression, and so there is legacy of advocacy for that. In terms of misogyny, I think that I have to plead guilty, and I think corporately our eyes are being opened gradually. So in my book, there's not much. There was, again, you could point to individual Adventists who were in favor of women's suffrage, for example, but there was really, to my knowledge, no sense of Adventists rallying to that as they did to religious liberty, as they did to temperance, prohibition, even not so much politically, but still on the matter of racial equality. So that's an area where we need to learn and do better. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Simona, for your question. I'd like to come to my good friend Peter now. Peter?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Morgan, for your presentation. Before the break, in regard to one of David's questions, you mentioned the word multiculturalism without elaborating too much on it. We hear today in our society that some of our leaders are proclaiming strongly that our strength consists in multiculturalism. On the other side, the same leaders and many others, they recognize that our country is divided. Well, in regard to this, if we look at multiculturalism in relation with one of Jesus saying that a house divided against itself, it cannot stand. How do you see and how do you appreciate this problem of multiculturalism? And if you can add something more to how multiculturalism is influencing our church today.
Okay, thank you. I will try to speak to that maybe in a couple of different ways. One thing that is part of the concern that I expressed earlier in response to the whole question of is there a difference between now and 2000 when my book Adventism and the American Republic was published, is that I have seen Adventist versions of what is called the replacement theory in politics, that we don't want diversity. We don't want people from other cultures coming in because they will change the church. And that concerns me greatly. Now, I don't know how strong that is. So that's why I'm not sure how to gauge it. Now, I guess another way of responding to that would be to say that some people would probably want to say, well, what you're talking about multiculturalism, you're talking about some kind of secularist agenda. And to that, I would say, well, whatever. But Adventism at its heart, just look at the first angel's message, is multicultural. It's about every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. That's at the heart of the message. So it's something that is very, I see as very important, as central. And yeah, I don't know whether if I really answered what you were getting at, but those are some thoughts.
Yes, but what about having a core that we should rally around? And even at the national level, we should have a core of values that we are subscribing to, because otherwise, if as the old Romans say, "Vot capita tot sententia," that means as many heads are, as many ideas are, we are going to have anarchy.
Okay, all right. So I guess where I would feel most comfortable is to say that for Adventists, it should be our own values that drive a welcoming view of diversity and not making lines of distinction along racial, cultural lines. I think I have a better sense now of what your question is, and I don't know that I can really say much. I feel a little bit suspicious about too strong an effort to say, well, we should not have diverse languages, say, in our education, or and emphasize English and that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's exactly what you're getting at, but that I think that there is a danger then of going against our own values. While at the same time, I also think that it is a good point that both Adventism and America, if you look at our founding documents, do stand for something, which hopefully is not going to be limited to, along racial cultural lines. But I think it's a good thing that everyone who wants to become a citizen swears to the Constitution. Again, it's probably not going to be a really adequate answer for you, but that's a stab at it.
Thank you for trying.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Peter. I'd like to go to Sue Lewis at this time. Sue?
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I was wondering about Ellen White. I've read statements that she's made about leave politics alone. It divides people. Let's not get involved. And yet race was a very political issue in her day. And she took what might be considered a rather radical stance regarding it in her day. So, and some Adventists were involved in the Underground Railroad. They evidently felt very comfortable in being involved in quote unquote politics. Politics and moral issues are so often intertwined. So even Christ, his stances on the Sabbath divided people, and yet he felt it was important to take a stance on it because it reflected who God is and what he's like. And so you, having had a chance to read a much wider spectrum of what she wrote, I wondered if you had any idea about some of the statements that she made about not voting, not getting involved in politics. I know she did say you can vote on, as far as I'm concerned, it's a good thing to vote for prohibition, whatever you think about its effectiveness. She did say, I'm voting on it, even if it's Sabbath, I'm voting on it. And so I wonder what you might think about what she meant when she said, don't, just leave politics alone.
Right. I think it's important always to consider the context, not only of a particular, we like to say, okay, here's a statement, but that statement was part of a letter or an article that was given to meet a purpose. It wasn't just written just so to set forth a thought that randomly. So there's a situational context as well, and then there's the larger context of what Ellen White said throughout her career. There has to be a balance. So let me try to say two things as succinctly as I can, which can be a little bit of difficulty for me, but let me give it a try. In the mid-1890s, there was a third party that came along called the People's Party, the Populist Party. And that was especially popular on the farms, but the rural influence was much stronger politically, the Midwest, so forth, than perhaps that it is now. And this party advocated for a lot of radical reforms that were intended to give a greater justice to the average people, and empower them politically, get more regulation, say, of the railroads that were so powerful, the telegraph and so forth, so that these things were for the good of the people. And this movement had a lot of potential. It drew from both the Democratic and Republican parties. And then in 1896, now, again, I hope that this doesn't get too convoluted, but we would try to focus it here. But the Populist Party and the Democratic Party fused around William Jennings Bryan, who made his famous Cross of Gold speech, because one thing that they were advocating, that is the populists, and now the Democrats fused with them, is that we need free coinage of silver. That is going to be a panacea economically. Well, some Adventists were attracted to this, and and teachers, pastors, and so forth. So one of the testimonies from Ellen White that is most commonly quoted as far as not getting involved in politics, not dividing the church over politics and so forth, is in that setting. But to me, it is very interesting to look more fully at what she actually says in the main document there. And it's not only that we should not be compromising our allegiance to a political party, we should not be dividing ourselves around political parties, but she thought that this free silver idea, not the other reforms, many of which have come into our national life subsequently, but she thought that this free silver idea was dangerous and that it would cause problems for the poorer classes, that it would hurt them. And it turns out, when historians have looked at this more carefully, they've seen, look, the reason why Bryan actually didn't win is that his program did not have anything that was meaningful for the growing working class in the cities. Now, furthermore, in that same, so many people have taken that to say, okay, we don't get involved, but in politics, but we kind of want law and order. We kind of want to be aligned with establishment conservative republicanism. But in that same testimony, she says, when the voice of the only begotten Son of God is heard, you will not use your voice or your influence to support policies that will enrich a few and hurt, wish I had the exact language, is better than that, the poorer classes of humanity. So she was not endorsing just this sort of passivity or acceptance of exploitation that was in many ways even more striking then of the working and lower classes. So there's a complexity there that I think has to be borne in mind. Then when it comes to race, again, context is really crucial. I do think that we have to say, whatever we may think of it, that for Ellen White, the church and its mission was more important than any political issues. So when there was a violent reaction to the mission that her son was leading to the South, in the mid and later 1890s, and it came down to whether the Adventist work would be conducted for both races. If that was going to be the case, and you did not want to provoke a violent backlash, and again, this was not just some imagined thing, it was happening to the Adventist workers, who, for one thing, were accused of teaching the black sharecroppers how to diversify their crops and get free from that system and that economic control. So then she you find her saying, we should not be agitating the race issue in that context, because she wanted the church to be able to go forward and carry out its program separate from the political realm, which was about the restoration of the whole person, and to be able to do that for both races. Now, we can say, well, that really doesn't measure up. We can't accept some of that. Well, that I think is perfectly fine if you understand the context, if you understand what is at stake. So that attention to the situation, I think, can help us resolve some of these conflicts. But suffice it to say, since I've taken 5-10 minutes to answer your question, it's not easy. It takes a lot of careful thought to get this, but we should not be manipulated by people who take out snippets of, I think that should be clear, at least here and there, and try to make them the whole of what she thought on this or that.
Yes, oh, that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you again. In the interest of getting people that haven't had a question yet, I'm going to skip over a couple of our hands who've already asked questions to go to my good friend in witness protection, McKinley.
Thank you so much, Forrest. Thanks, Dave, for raising the perspective of T.J. Rowling, I think is the name that you mentioned, concerning Mrs. White. And sort of piggybacking off Sue's question, but just a comment. And thanks to Dr. Morgan also for the response. I listened very carefully and want to reread for emphasis what you said, and I hope I captured what you said precisely. Because I think some commentators have isolated certain statements of Mrs. White on this topic concerning race to put her in a less positive light. This is what you said. E.G. White completely was dedicated to human equality that transcends race. And I just thought that was so very important to restate, because I've heard in other circles certain statements of Mrs. White concerning African Americans and the slavery issue to suggest that she thought less of African Americans. And in my readings of many of her writings, I would find it very, very hard to come to that conclusion that she thought less of African Americans.
Well, yes, thank you. Now, something comes to my mind, and I'm having a senior moment as to the name of this author, but he's a very famous Ibram X. Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, I believe. I haven't read that one, but Stamped from the Beginning, brilliant book. The reason I think that he is relevant for this discussion is that he classifies as racist statements that emphasize the fact, I should not say the fact, but that emphasize the point that because of social cultural influences, African Americans have somehow a lesser capacity and are somehow at a lower level culturally and morally and so forth. And he says that that's one form of racism. Now, the reason I think that this is helpful for us to understand Ellen White and some of our other 19th century forebears is that Kendi includes statements from Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., that all sort of express this kind what he actually calls racist, and he's not calling them racists, but he's calling them, he says that these type of views that kind of suggest a pattern of lesser capacity, lesser morality, even recognizing that it's caused by social conditions. He says that those are racist. Now, my point is not so much to say that he's exactly correct in the way he breaks it down, but I just think it's very helpful to say that we can find in Ellen White statements that are racist, however we want to define that, if we follow someone like Kendi. But we have to take a nuanced view of those, just as we would statements from King and Du Bois and Douglas and so forth, and not say, oh, well, their whole careers are defined by racism, you see. So that's one other thing that occurs to me to add to that line of thought.
Okay, thank you. David, are you there? Okay, I would tell David.
I most certainly am here.
Well, it's the bewitching hour, and I've got 2 hands up, and I didn't know if you want to hold those off to the foodless potluck, or
Have these people had a chance to ask their questions?
Yes, they have.
Why don't we conclude for now, and then invite people to stay by for the digital foodless potluck, and that continues the discussion as long as it wants to go, sometimes a couple of hours, so people can stay by and talk about this or anything else they want to. Doug Morgan has more than fulfilled his promise to us, and if he wants to stay, he surely is welcome, but we don't expect that of him. So McKinley will soon take over. If you're here, we'll just turn off the recording, but everything else will remain the same, so you can continue to participate. Bronwyn and I are going to move on to the next agenda for us for today. Thank you, Doug. Thank you so very much. This has been wonderful.
Excellent presentation.
Next week.
Well, I just want to say you're very welcome, and again, thank you for the invitation. It's a delight and privilege for me.
Okay, so next week we're going to look at the issue of race in a much more focused way, and then on the third week the issue of war and peace in a much more focused way. So I'm inviting the people for next week to look up your book and buy it, called Change Agents: The Lay Movement that Challenged the System and Turned Adventism Toward Racial Justice. There it is, Change Agents. And one can get it on Kindle for $4.95 or in paperback for $14.95. And that's the homework to be read between now and next week.
By the way,
Lord
Dr.
bless
Morgan,
you.
I'm going to say Dr. Morgan needs to put up back of him his book like they do on a lot of the TV programs.
I should have put it up in the background so it was just there all the way along. But it's only available on Amazon, but it's easily available, and as Dave pointed out, it's quite inexpensive, especially Kindle. But
I wanted to buy the hard copy of your book that we were discussing today, and it is available on Amazon for $495. So I decided I would stick with the PDF version.
Yes.
Okay, here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Dr.